Classic Doom's pacing can be summed up as room after room of enemies encounters, and if you enter a room and all the enemies are dead, then you're lost. That getting lost is an example of a failed 30-second cycle. I'm not going to be here to deny my love for Classic Doom, but no game is perfect, and this is a prime example of it. The 30-second cycle is a concept in games that's been thrown around every so often, but is underlooked in the overall grand scheme of video game criticism. The most popular example of this concept being talked about by a game developer is Jamie Greisemer.
In Halo 1, there was maybe 30 seconds of fun that happened over and over and over and over again. So if you can get 30 seconds of fun, you can pretty much stretch that out to be an entire game.
As long as the game nails 30 seconds, then developers can cycle those 30 seconds, and if done right, then that's a full game. Obviously, Halo CE wasn't all just cycles and cycles of fights, although that's what a good chunk of the game is. The idea is that those 30 seconds are what keeps players going. In order to better understand the concept of a 30-second cycle, I will explore some games and get into why said games go about creating a 30-second cycle of their own, and showing how they succeed but how they also fail. The ultimate goal here is to understand the 30-second cycle. Video games can be an endless limit of possibilities if one oh so pleases, but at the end of the day, there's no reasonable way to just spew out infinite enemy types, all that do different things and interact with the world in different ways. So quite often, developers will take a more minimalist approach to their games. Don't get this confused with do as little as possible, as that would lead to a lame game, but instead more like how many assets are needed to complete our vision of this game. Halo Combat Evolved has a total of 8 enemy types, and yet it's a 10-hour game with little to no feeling of repetition. This is achieved with the 30-second cycle. It's hard to describe what the 30-second cycle is with just words, so I'll throw in a visual aid to best describe my thought process. I'm going to say that the 30-second cycle is a video clip of 30 seconds for simplicity. The beginning of the 30 seconds is the beginning of, let's say, a combat encounter. After the 30 seconds ends, another 30-second cycle can start. This could be the same kind of cycle, or it could be a completely different 30-second cycle, one to resupply and heal up and whatnot. But that cycle can't be done for too long, or game reviewers like myself would say that the game is extremely boring because there's too much of a gap between the fun shooty shit. Yes, the 30-second cycle can be longer than 30 seconds. In fact, it could also be shorter than 30 seconds. The name shouldn't be taken to be literal. I'm confident that unless you're a god speedrunner, most boss fights and enemy waves will take longer than 30 seconds. The point of the title of the concept is that there has to be a balance between shooting everything and some breathing room in between. If the recovery cycle is too long, then the game would be boring and turn out to be a boring game, but if the combat is too long, then the game would be seen as a repetitive, non-stop snooze fest. This brings me back to the Doom example from the very beginning, where there are effectively two 30-second cycles present in the game, the combat and the lack of combat. The biggest problem is that Classic Doom's level design leaves much to be desired because it's not very good at communicating with the player on where to go. This is opposed to id's later titles like Quake, where it's very effective at telling the player when it's a room that they haven't been in before or a room that's entirely unnecessary to go into. It's not entirely gone, but it's significantly reduced. When playing Super Mario 64, it's easy to assume that the entire 30-second cycle is from selecting the star and collecting it. However, that's a misinterpretation, because if that were the case, then Mario 64 would be considered a boring platforming game. Instead, the 30-second cycle starts and ends at the beginning of the next set of obstacles. This would make more sense to me personally, because a cycle needs to be short in order for it to be a good cycle. The average star would take around 5 to 10 minutes, which would make it a bad cycle if it were designed that way. This is why many stages in SM64 fail to provide good platforming. The water stages are a clear example, but when the entirety of Whomp's Fortress consists of mostly walking, it tends to come out as a boring stage. This is opposed to the Bowser stages, which are by far the best ones in the game. Alternatively, a game like Celeste could easily be said as each screen's beginning a new cycle. The game is relatively faster, and each screen most of the time can be beaten in one shot, but it's designed that way really well. Roguelikes have an advantage in departments like this, where the 30-second cycle starts when you enter a new room and it continues until you enter another one. Binding of Isaac is a pretty fast-paced roguelike, so when the room is cleared, this cycle resets for the next room. And every room being different, and therefore every time you do a run it's a different experience, this cycle lives perfect in harmony with the 30-second cycle concept. This is likely why roguelikes are a very popular genre where people can sink in hundreds of hours into a pretty simple game in concept. Isaac and similar games aren't the only roguelikes because there are different types of roguelikes. Hero Siege has a huge emphasis on horde combat, and when the combat can get really wild, each little group of enemies are their own start to the 30-second cycle. And the 30-second cycle is successful because the reality is that killing groups of enemies is just plain fun, hence Devil May Cry. Even though I spent half an hour reviewing Devil May Cry, I didn't really get into that game's 30-second cycle, and that's just because at the time I didn't really see this aspect of game design. To put it simply, when basically every room in the game has enemies encounters, it's easy to understand how the 30-second cycle in action games work. Sorta jumping back to roguelikes, although Left 4 Dead 2 isn't a roguelike, games that have a high amount of randomness like Left 4 Dead 2 have a good 30-second cycle. There is seriously never a moment in this game where nothing is going on because of how random it is. Left 4 Dead 2 is one of the most replayable games out there, not just because of its multiplayer, but also because its randomness is so similar to a roguelike that no two playthroughs will ever be the same. It's honestly a shame there's no good game that lives up to how good Left 4 Dead 2 was, so the only real option is just to replay Left 4 Dead 2 for the 100th time. Racing games are weird because our lot are pretty different. The Mario Kart games and similar titles, 30-second cycles, is each area and each track. You could even say each track is a new 30-second cycle because they're all pretty short, and if it's a good track, then it's a good cycle. But then there's racing games like Need for Speed Most Wanted, which is more of an open world title, but the game does something smart with this idea by adding random police officers into the world. Seriously, the cops in this game are insane, and they're designed quite well, as roughly every 30 seconds or so, the cops get more intense just to try to stop you. Eventually, the chase gets so crazy that you are the cops' one and only focus so they can stop you. The intense music adds to all this, leading to a good 30-second cycle in an open world racing game. In the context of open world, how does a normal open world non-racing game pull off a good 30-second cycle? The missions in the world are one thing, but when simply traversing the open world, how does something like this get a good 30-second cycle going? Just looking at the surroundings can't do everything here. That's why most open world games have random events. Whether it's a random bandit in Oblivion or enemy camps in Breath of the Wild, open world games have to find a way to have a beautiful world to sightsee at and keep players engaged through it enough to keep exploring. And the best way to prove if it works or not is if you complement the game as having a good open world. Most open world games seem to fail this because while there are things to do in the open world like enemy camps, most of the time they just feel like a glorified hub world to explore. The biggest example of this is Halo Infinite. Personally, I'd much rather just head to the next mission in the game and not roam around exploring because this open world is just so boring. Of course, making an interesting open world is easier said than done, and I have no doubt that developers at least try their best to make one, but at the end of the day, most fail in this department. It's really unfortunate because with the right vision, developers can make amazing open world games. It's just that most of the time it's unnecessary because it's trying to hit a sales number and not inherently make a good game. Open world just looks flashy on a game box, so it makes sense to make every single game you make an open world game just to avoid false advertising. The 30-second cycle is such an interesting concept to me. It's interesting to see how games can stay engaging despite all having a form of repetition. I didn't even get to every genre of games I could have talked about, but that's okay. I could have very easily gotten into the horror games and maybe even fighting games and probably stealth games, but I feel like I should just leave this video where it is here.